Okay, I've got to navigate everything over here. So thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Jay. So I'm going to steal the line of my friend and studio mate, Sophie Blackall, when she read here. It was the last reading I went to here. And she said, it's just so exciting to not have to read a book upside down, which is what we as children's book illustrators always have to do. So I'm going to just start by reading the opening of the book. The Reagan budget, atrocities in El Salvador, the Polish Solidarity Movement, 3 Mile Island. These were some of the headlining stories on the CBS Evening News broadcast of February 19th, 1982. After getting through all these reports and more, a teaser tried to get viewers to stick through another slate of commercials for the final segment of the evening, a defeated measure. The story appeared a few minutes before 7 o'clock and was introduced by Dan Rather, who had replaced Walter Cronkite the year before. Other countries have done it for years, but in this country, conversion to the metric system didn't draw many converts and only inched along. Rather said, and then kicked the segment to the reporter. Bob Schiffer has more on what it takes to kill a meter. After a lot of hoopla and millions of tax dollars spent on commercials and other things to tell us why we needed to go metric, it is the metric system that's about to go, a new victim of the Reagan budget cut, of the Reagan budget axe. So what he actually wasn't talking about, Reagan didn't actually axe the metric system. What he did was he defunded something called the U.S. Metric Board, a lady of which was playing in one of those PSAs earlier. The report went on to interview a few folks about the issue, including these two, who were arch enemies of the metric system. Tom Wolfe was at the time working on Bonfire of the Vanities, but his big success up to that point, one of his big successes, had been The Right Stuff about astronauts. So he got on and was noting that NASA had managed to go to the moon using inches and pounds, so they certainly didn't need the metric system, and said that he said it was the whole metric system was to blame on intellectuals and those people who believed things were done better in Europe. And we're still the most obedient little colonials when it comes to things intellectual. The other guy is Stuart Brand, who Wolfe had actually introduced to the world in the electric Kool-Aid acid test. He had been briefly one of Ken Casey's merry pranksters. But Brand had gone on to found the Whole Earth catalog, which in his commencement speech, Steve Jobs called Google 35 years before Google came around. He was mostly, well, he was against basically anything that was being pushed on the world by global capitalism, which he felt the metric system was certainly doing. He also believed really deeply in the concept of that measures came from the human body and that there was something very important in that. Now, A Defeated Measure aired on my 12th birthday, February 19th, 1982. My life, my entire existence had basically been coincident with America's move toward the metric system. When I was still in the crib, the National Bureau of Standards report came out that said it was time for America to go metric and that should happen within 10 years. In 1975, Gerald Ford signed it into law with the Metric Act, and in which he said that we had miles to go before we achieved what we were looking for. And then, when I turned 12, the board was killed. Now, I have really very scattered memories. I remember like this blue plastic ruler that had metric measures on it. I remember that we weren't supposed to do anything else. Like we didn't even have to learn customary measures in grammar school and then into middle school. I also had this activity book. Now, I basically loved anything to do with superheroes. And it's pretty amazing that this book was even too boring for me to want to do. And it was by this guy, Tony Tallarico, this comics guy, who was also famous for doing a comic book called The Great Society with Super LBJ. He also did, what was it called? He did another one that was, I think, Super Bob and Teddy, which was the Kennedy boys as Batman and Robin, saving the earth from evil conservatives. So he had a really black and white worldview, which I think you can also see from the Maze section, where it's Metric Man racing against bad man who was racing in miles per hour. Which gives you something also, an idea of the tenor of the whole metric argument back then. Now to get to what Stewart Brand was talking about, and what Stewart Brand really was one of the main guys who was a huge roadblock to metric actually happening. He was obsessed with body measures. So, by the way, I did not do this chart. We all know the foot. That's kind of the most obvious. I also grew up in the horse business. My family had a horse farm, and you measure horses in hands because it's really easy to go this way. A hand being about 4 inches. Hand measures were actually historically one of the most popular measures of all. The span is if you go from the tip of your thumb to the tip of your pinky or one of the other ones. The actual term span comes from that. As does the fathom, to have your arms spread wide apart. The idea of fathoming something comes from taking up depth measures when you wind the anchor's rope around. The cubit, which comes from basically the elbow, it's the forearm, was actually really the greatest measure of all. It's the one everything in the Bible is measured in the ark. It was also carried from Islam all the way to in Indonesia, and actually still survives in Myanmar as their main measure. One of the things with the metric system, I think people get their minds into the idea that it's all about replacing the foot and the pound and everything else, but it really doesn't have much to do with that. It all has to do with the decimal fractions and basically the way of dividing stuff. The reason that the metric system was needed in the first place was that decimals actually aren't such a great way to divide things. If you ever try dividing a pizza into 10 slices or 5 slices, it's really not very easy. It's really easy to do into 4, 6, 8. If you got a Sicilian pie, you might do it in 12 or 16. The only thing that 10 is good for is counting on your fingers. So they're excellent for tallying when you just have to have a running tally of something, but they're just not good for fractions. One of the things that was kind of blew me away when I was researching the book is that the decimal fraction, the decimal point, had to be invented, and it was invented a few times, but it only caught on when this guy invented it, Simon Stevin. I'm sure you guys all have your French savants and inventors trading cards. You have in the attic somewhere, mom's attic. So Simon Stevin was perhaps the greatest Flemish scientist of all time. And when he was still in school and university, he wrote a little pamphlet called DIME. It's spelled D-I-S-M-E. And it basically introduced decimal fractions. It basically went nowhere for about 100 years. And then the 17th century, mathematicians started to use it. By the 18th century, though, decimals had caught on among the educated folks. Some of the people who were really into the idea of decimals were these guys. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and the other more Weasley-looking guy is Governor Morris. They were all involved in the creation of the dollar. The dollar is the first purely decimal measure that was ever put forward by a country. Up until that point, everything was divided essentially into halves, quarters, 12ths especially. Almost everything that the Roman Empire ever did was into 12ths. Shillings were 20ths of a pound, and that came from Charlemagne. So anyway, they had this idea that the new country had to have a revolutionary system of measurement to go along with the revolutionary idea. So they came up with this, the first coin ever minted. And you can see the spelling of the original spelling of dime. It didn't change until about 100 years later, was D-I-S-M-E. Obvious tribute to old Simon Stevin. Now, Thomas Jefferson did not want to stop there. He actually came up with an entire decimal system while he was Secretary of State, the first Secretary of State. Washington basically charged him with coming up with a system of American measurement. Didn't really give any, didn't kibitz in any way. But he came up with the first, really the first comprehensive system of decimal measurement that was ever proposed to a government.